Hi, I'm Jeff Stark. Thanks for being with me today. Biblical counselors are increasingly finding a particular kind of client show up at their door and requesting biblical counseling. And that is a husband and wife who have struggled with the matter of pornography. Hardly a week goes by without I'm not having to counsel a husband or a wife or a couple who are not struggling through a husband's addiction in the area of pornography. In the first session, it's usually the husband who sheepishly says to me, the counselor, after I pray and ask, how can I be helpful and what brings you here today? The husband will say, well, my wife discovered me one night recently doing pornography. I thought she'd gone to bed. I'd snuck downstairs. She came downstairs wondering why I wasn't in bed with her and found me doing pornography, observing pornography, and perhaps even masturbating. And so he's very sheepish about that. He said, I got caught, and I'm sorry about what I've done. But my wife is very upset, and she's very angry, and I'm here because I need help, and I think we need help together. And of course, when it's the wife's turn to tell me and answer the question, how can I be helpful, she says, I did catch him about 2 weeks ago. I can't stop crying. I'm very upset. He never told me he had this problem, for example, or he told me, he said he got over it. But when I drilled down in terms of this problem, he never really gave it up. He only went from being frequent to infrequent, but back to frequent after we got married. And now I'm realizing that my husband has been sexually unfaithful to me in this pornographic experience. And secondly, he's been lying to me all this time, and now I can't trust him. And so there's been lying and falsehoods and deceit, and now we're not only suffering on the sexual area, but we're also suffering very deeply in terms of my ability to trust him when he tells me something. If he lied in this, well, what else is he lying about? And when he tells me, I'm telling you the truth, I can't believe him, because I pressed this issue before. He would tell me there's no problem, and there's turned out to be a terrible problem. So sadly, biblical counselors are more and more frequently having clients show up, husbands, wives, and sometimes single guys, and sometimes some single gals showing up with this problem of pornography, not only in terms of how it's affecting my life, but then again, how is it affecting the woman that I happen to be married to, or the husband that I happen to be married to. Helping a couple through this problem is very, very challenging, but it's something that God wants couples to do, that wants to work through and come out successfully, and that's what biblical counselors spend their time trying to do in this matter of pornography as well as other matters. Okay, so what we're going to do in these series of videos that we're just going to title Pornography, there are truths that are crucial for a husband and for a wife to understand as they wrestle through coming through this successfully and well with God's help and with good counseling. What I'd like to do today is just pass along two things very quickly, very short, but nonetheless very, very foundational for a husband and wife to understand as they proceed in counseling. So here's number one. One of the things that I say very early on, if not in the first session, is I say to the wife, I say to her clearly and rather firmly, but I say to her, let's give her the name of Becky. I'll just pick the name Becky out of my hat here. So I'll turn to Becky and I'll say, Becky, after having heard your story for an hour or two, there's one thing that I'd like to make very, very clear to you very, very early, because I think it will be very, very helpful to you. And it would be very, very important for you to know this. And that is this. Your husband's addiction to pornography, your husband's interest in pornography has absolutely nothing to do with you. This has nothing to do with you. Your husband's interest in pornography and masturbation is something that has to do with him entirely and completely, altogether, alone with him. And this has nothing, virtually nothing, to do with you. And I'm saying that to you right now, Becky, because most wives, when they see their husbands or they hear their husbands are doing this, the first thing that they ask themselves, and they ask themselves for a very long period of time, is, where have I failed? What have I done to contribute to this? Did I do too much of this? Did I do too little of this? He's telling me if we did this, or if we stopped doing this, or did more of this, he wouldn't be having this problem. And it's basically said that the problem that he has is because I'm failing in terms of being a wife in one way or another. But I try to make it very, very clear to her that this is not about you. There's nothing about this problem that involves you, quite honestly. And I want to show you that. I want to show your husband this as well. And then I turn to Luke chapter 6. And I read to them something that Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount in verses 43, 44, and 45, and 45, when Jesus says this: "No good tree bears bad fruit, nor does a bad tree bear good fruit. Each tree is recognized by its own fruit. People do not pick figs from thorn bushes or grapes from briars." Very importantly, verse 45 now. Now, the agricultural metaphor now being applied to a person's life. The good man brings good things out of the good stored up in his heart, and the evil man brings evil things out of the evil stored up in his heart. For out of the overflow of his heart, the mouth speaks. Now, what Jesus is doing is using an agricultural metaphor to teach us something about ourselves. When evil things come out of my lips, Jesus is talking about verbal sins here, evil things coming. Where does that come from? Well, Jesus says it comes from an evil heart. For out of the abundance of an evil heart, the mouth speaks evil things. But if the heart or the root is good, then the fruit will be good. Or if we apply it to our Jesus as a person, he says that if a person has a good heart, then what will proceed out of his mouth will be good things. So if you hear good things, then it originates from a good heart. But if you hear bad things, it originates from a bad heart. So when I ask the husband and wife, well, pornography, is that good fruit or bad fruit? And eventually, after they think about it, they say, well, it is fruit, and it must come from a bad root. Absolutely. And they've got that right, and that's pretty simplistic. Pornography, no one would say pornography is good, but pornography is a fruit that is we would identify as a bad fruit, which originates where? Well, it originates in a bad root, that is to say, in a bad heart. And so I would turn to Becky and I say, Becky, your husband does pornography, which is fruit, because when he's doing that, he's got a bad root. This has nothing to do with you, I would say to her. This has nothing to do with you. Pornography is bad fruit that originates in a bad heart. And so I don't know to what degree your husband Tom has been telling you that this problem really starts and originates in what you're doing or not doing, but the scriptures are very, very clear that this has nothing to do with you and as it relates to your marriage. Pornography starts and originates in the heart. And in this case, if he's got a bad heart, it's going to come out with bad fruit, and in this case, it would be pornography. And so when a woman understands what's being said here, she also begins to get a little bit teary, usually, because she's been beating herself up, perhaps because of things that her husband has said, or just because she thinks there's got to be some connection between why he's doing this and me being a good wife or being a bad wife. But she understands now and is liberated from taking any blame for her husband's pornography and what he does subsequent to looking at pornography, which is masturbation. It's not uncommon for a husband to try to blame his wife for that problem, but now the wife understands, wow, it has nothing to do with me. And sometimes it's a great wife, a good wife, a godly wife who now feels liberated, realizing that it has nothing to do with her. Really, it really doesn't. But it may be a bad wife. He may be married to Becky, who's a bad wife, but even so, even though she may be a bad wife, his pornography and his masturbation originates not in the fact that he's married to a bad woman, but rather he's got a bad heart. So Becky, in this case, is liberated and happy to know that this is not her failure as a wife, failing to help her husband in these matters, but rather it's something that he has to take sole and complete responsibility for. And there is no blame on her part. She's there in marriage counseling thinking to some degree this is a marital matter, and therefore she needs some help and instruction on what she's doing or not doing that may be contributing or causing this problem. But now Becky understands that bad fruit comes from a bad root. Bad fruit doesn't come from a bad marriage. Bad fruit comes from a bad root. Okay, so the Beckys who come for counseling, whose husbands have been caught doing pornography, come happy when they hear that they are not to blame for their husband's pornography and masturbation habit. Now, when the husband Tom hears this, well, then Tom understands, and he really knows that this is really true, that his pornographic use really originates from his own heart and his bad heart. So the question is, what's going on in Tom's heart that is the root of his pornographic and masturbation habit? We're going to look at that in our next video, which will be video number 2. But video number 1, dealing with this matter of a husband and wife who comes for counseling, the first thing, and by the way, the first thing, but the repetitive thing that I need to remind the wife over and over about in the first early stages of counseling is, remember now, this has nothing to do with you. I'm not saying you're a good wife, and I'm not saying you're a bad wife, but I am saying, and Jesus is saying, this pornography and this masturbation literally has nothing to do with you. It originates in your husband's heart. And so that's usually very, very, very good news for the wife. Now, she's still got a husband who is struggling and perhaps addicted, and who she can't trust, and whom she's feeling has been unfaithful to her. But she is liberated in understanding it's not because of her failure that's causing this particular issue. And that's helpful for a wife to understand. And if you're a wife who's watching this, then I would hope this would be extremely helpful to you as well. In our second video, we'll turn to Tom and say, Tom, this problem, if you've been blaming your wife for this problem, it's time to stop doing that. In number 2, this problem, says Jesus, originates in your heart, and let's talk about what's going on in your heart that has caused this problem of pornography and masturbation. We'll look at this also in video number 2, coming up soon. Thanks for joining with me today.